सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The story that's also been sort of brewing or that's been discussed, and that's caught our fascination or caught our imagination. That is of the commandos of Special Frontier Force, which consists largely of Tibetan refugee population in India, because one of its officers died in an operation, not in combat. Looks like he and a colleague of his stepped over an old 1962 abandoned mine, but in a very crucial operation, going and occupying a very important height in the Chushul sector. His funeral drew a lot of interest. BJP General Secretary Ram Madhav was there. And you know the news value of that event. And that's also brought in a lot of curiosity about what is Special Frontier Force. So I will talk to you a little bit about Special Frontier Force. Also, while I tell you the history a little bit and what exactly it is, its details, it also gives me a little opportunity for storytelling. So I will do a little storytelling also, a little personal storytelling also. Now, Special Frontier Force was set up in 1962 on 14th of November. Why 14th of November? It could be because as a writer who I'm a big fan of, Claude RP, he's a French writer, now lives in Pondicherry, who writes about Tibet, India-China issues, etc., etc., etc. So he says that it's not as if India discovered psychophancy only recently. 14th November is Children's Day, Jawaharlal Nehru's birthday. Jawaharlal Nehru was quite beleaguered at that point in 1962. This is before the Chinese had called unilateral ceasefire, I think around 22nd of November, 22nd November, depending on how you date it. So his intelligence czar then B.N. Malik, who came up with this idea of this covert force that could, of Tibetan refugees who could operate behind Chinese lines. It was formally shown as having been launched on 14th of November 1962, although the idea had come up on 22nd of October the same year, that is 2 days after the Chinese invasion started. Now 19th November is when Nehru wrote two really anxious letters to John Kennedy, basically saying that he needed machine guns, fighter planes, etc., 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 that he was in trouble and he needed help. When that happened, and you will get a lot of details again from Claude RP's article, which I am sharing with you in the description, and this is an article from a 2014 edition of Indian Defence Review. So thank you, Indian Defence Review also. So see that article. After these letters, there was a meeting in the White House, which was attended among others by Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State, and Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense. He became quite famous or infamous because of his appearances in the Vietnam War situation. Anyway, so the Americans then decided that they had to send a delegation to India to figure out exactly what did India need, how sincere India was. So McNamara then sent a delegation to India headed by Avril Harriman, who was a very well reputed and scholarly advisor on Asian affairs to US Secretary of State. So they came into India, the CIA chief was involved, and some of the other detail that we have of how this group was set up comes from a book by Kenneth Conboy and James Morrison, who wrote a book called The CIA Secret War in Tibet. I will mention Kenneth Conboy in connection with yet another book in just a little while. In that book, The CIA Secret War in Tibet, Kenneth Conboy and James Morrison have quoted David Blee, BLEE, who was the CIA station chief in India at that point, who's talked about some of these processes on how this was set up. After that, this group carried out some operations across the line of actual control. In fact, by 1963, it had become important to also impose some restraints on it. So it could not carry out sort of autonomous actions across the line of actual control because the India-China situation was a sensitive situation. This group has always been headed by a serving Major General of the Indian Army, although when he heads this group, SFF, Special Frontier Force, he calls himself, or he is called Inspector General. That's because this is not a unit of Indian Army. Indian Army General is on deputation to head it. This unit reports directly to Cabinet Secretariat. That is where the RAW and the ARC, Aviation Research Center, etc. also report. So to that extent, it's a special resource. Now, has it been used in battle before? Once again, this has made me read up more and remember more, and that's the reason I said I can do a little storytelling for you today also. So in 1971 war, about 2,500 to 3,000 of these troops were used in Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh. Now, Chittagong hill tracts is where you have this very undefined and very poorly guarded border between East Pakistan, or you had East Pakistan and Burma, what is now Myanmar. A lot of Indian rebels, particularly Mizos, were hiding there, and also a lot of the Pakistani armed forces were hiding there. There was a full brigade there, and they had also secured that area as an escape route in case they were not able to defend East Pakistan from Indian Army. So that brigade and many others would have escaped from there. They also had the equivalent of a battalion headquarters of Pakistani Special Forces, which is the Special Services Group, SST, located there. So that is where these SFF troops were sent in. Story about them, once again, we rely on a book written by a Major General S.S. Oban, who actually founded SFF, and when he founded SFF, you know that story by now. It was initially called Force 22 because during the Second World War, where he emerged a big war hero, won the military cross, like Sam Manekshaw, he had headed a unit called 22nd Mountain Artillery Brigade. So he carried the name 22 with him, and so this establishment was also called Establishment 22 or Establishment 22. In fact, if you go to Chakrata and if you go to Sarsawa near Dehradun and you ask people where is Establishment 22, you are more likely that people will tell you what where Establishment 22 is than if you said it is Special Frontier Force. So General Oban came back and he headed this operation again. And he wrote about that operation in a book published in 1985. You will see a reference to the book on my screen also, called Phantoms of Chittagong. Now, there is also a little touching story about this, that at some point, say maybe coincidentally on 14th of November, which is the raising day of this unit, they decided to raid the Pakistani Special Services Group headquarters in Chittagong Hill Tract. And it was in the course of that attack that the Pakistani SST sentries thought they had seen some ghosts, and they began firing sort of blindly and indiscriminately. As they discovered the next day, they had hit somebody, and that somebody was none else than the commander, the Tibetan commander of the entire SFF contingent fighting in Chittagong Hill Tract. His name was Dhondup Gyato Tsang, and he had the rank of Dapon, D-A-P-O-N, which is the Tibetan language for brigadier. So an officer at that level sacrificed his life. In the operation, 56 of these SFF soldiers died, 190 were injured. Because it was a fully covert operation, nobody could be decorated, but nearly 600 of them were given cash prizes. In fact, the story goes, and I read this also in a piece in Dhaka Tribune that I am sharing with you, written by a well-established researcher called Salim Ahmed, who writes that Indira Gandhi actually did send a message to Tibetan guerrillas saying, listen, we can't order you, we can't demand that you fight in East Pakistan, but remember that Pakistani army is doing to Bengali is exactly what the Chinese PLA had done to you Tibetans. So if you are happy to fight, we'll be very grateful. And that's how it happened. So about 600 of these commandos were later given cash awards, but 56 killed, 190 wounded. But what did they achieve? They prevented any Pakistani units, the entire brigade, from escaping into Chittagong hill tracts. When the surrender came, they were within 40 kilometers of Chittagong. In fact, at one point they got so cocky that they wanted to take Chittagong, but they were reminded they didn't have artillery, etc. They also had better small arms than most of the rest of the Indian army. So if you want to read more about those operations, do check out that book's available. It's not out of print, called Phantoms of Chittagong, the 5th Army in Bangladesh by General S.S. Oban. And further, they were then used on secret missions again in Himalayas, especially the operation to plant a nuclear monitoring device on Nanda Devi, which has been written about a great deal. Again, that is recounted in a book which is available, not that old. It is a book called Spies in the Himalayas, Secret Missions and Perilous Climbs, written by Captain M.S. Kohli. And remember, I told you I'll bring this name back to you, by Kenneth Conboy. So check out that book, Spies in the Himalayas, Secret Missions and Perilous Climbs. Now someday I will talk about the other issue that preceded SFF in greater detail. That is, since the 50s, the American CIA had started running Tibetan guerrilla operations in Tibet. These were run not out of India so much as Nepal, a place called Mustang. And among the resources being employed there was the aircraft, mostly Dakotas, of an Indian maverick, adventurer, politician, public figure, the inimitable one and only Biju Patnaik, the father of Naveen Patnaik, currently the Chief Minister of Odisha. Biju Patnaik had something called Kalinga Airways. You could have private airlines those days. That airline or that resource was used by the CIA for dropping supplies, for dropping guerrillas deep inside Tibetan territory. In fact, that detail is also available in a book which unfortunately again is out of print, although I am trying to get a copy. That is a book called Operation Himalayas to Defend India's Sovereignty by Satya Narayan Sinha, who used to work with Biju Patnaik. So that is the other one, and that was quite an operation, and we know people who flew there. So there used to be a very well-known journalist, Udayan Nambudri, who unfortunately passed away, my former colleague in India today. His father was among those pilots who operated on those missions and unfortunately sacrificed his life in a crash when a parachute that they had dropped with supplies got caught up in the tail of their Dakota. So there are many such cases that we know, and that was quite an operation. Also, you want to read more, read up Claude RP, 1962, and the McMahon Line saga, Tibet, the Lost Frontier, and Dharamshala and Beijing, the negotiations that never were. Also, B.N. Malik, he is very controversial, but he was Nehru's spy chief for the longest time, and there was no RAW. So he straddled both external and internal intelligence. A trilogy of 3 books that he has written, which have a lot of detail. So that much for Exotica. That is what we had to tell you about SFF. And remember, I had promised you 3 stories, because this story itself has given me the opening to tell you those 3 stories. So number 1, General S.S. Oban, Major General S.S. Oban, who we said won his military cross in Second World War, who founded SFF. Now, in journalism, I say people are the capital of our lives. We keep running into them all the time, and they keep coming back into your life all the time. Much after what happened in 71 and 62, in late 80s at some point, I ran into India's Consul General in Karachi, that is Manilal Tripathi, and his wife Shashi Tripathi, who was looking after the media and the rest. Both grew to be very distinguished Indian ambassadors, one in Canada, one in Japan. And that's when I realized that they were part of the Oban family. So Shashi Oban was General Oban's niece and Manila Tripathi, wonderful man, unfortunately no more now, his brilliant nephew-in-law. And it's from them that I had first heard stories about his exploits in 1971 and of setting up the SFF. The commander of SFF usually in conversations is called Tutu. Who's the Tutu these days? Oh, so and so is the Tutu these days. So one of the officers who functioned as the head of SFF, or Mr. Tutu or General Tutu, was General Dalbir Singh, who later became Chief of Army Staff. So little story about him. Once again, people are the capital of our lives as journalists. It was during the Jaffna operations that I was driving to Jaffna along with a photographer, Sham Tekwani, and it had got sunset time. We were crossing the Elephant Pass and we saw this tiny patrol of Gurkha soldiers walk in, and a lanky, thin young captain start chatting with me to say that, look, this is not safe for you to be driving at this time into Jaffna. This area is heavily mined and there are many ambushes going on. So I'd rather that you stay overnight and then drive. And I said, but how can I stay overnight anywhere? This is a jungle. He said, doesn't matter. Come and sleep in my tent. So he gave us refuge in his tent and we chatted late into the night. He gave us food to eat. Obviously, Indian Army will always give you food to eat. That young captain was Captain Dalbir Singh, who later became the head of SFF, Tutu, and also the Chief of Army Staff. So that is story number 2. Now the story number 3 is about none else than the redoubtable Mr. B.N. Malik. So it was, I think, in 1984 that in India Today, I was asked to follow up the story because new revelations had just come out of how this nuclear monitoring device had been planted between CIA and Indian intelligence, essentially using Indian mountaineers on Nanda Devi. And this is just after India's maiden Everest triumph. Now, I was following here, there, not finding very much until I went to see B.N. Malik, because somebody said, look, B.N. Malik is retired, he's living in Vasant Vihar. His godchild or kind of adopted son-in-law is the current director of Intelligence Bureau, Mr. Brari, and he lives in his house in Vasant Vihar. So I called, he gave me time. He was quite happy to meet somebody so many years after he had been forgotten. So I went to his house on my motorbike, and as we sat down and I told him my purpose, he said, अरे भाई तुम मुझसे पूछ रहे हो, तुम अपने ऑफिस में जाओ और जो तुम्हारा जो एडिटर है सुमन दुबे, उसको पूछो, उसको तो ये सारे ऑपरेशन का पता है. So I came back and I asked Suman. Suman was sheepish as he is very cautious. He'll never tell you any secret that he thinks he should keep. Suman was a very well-reputed, globally reputed mountaineer, and he was very much a part of every big mountaineering expedition that took place in or around India at that time. So whether he went up on Nanda Devi or not is not relevant. He was definitely in the know, and it's much later that when Captain Kohli's book came out, that we got more details of this. This, however, won me the affection of old man, the wise old man, Mr. B.N. Malik, wise old controversial man, and I did drop by many times to hear more stories from him, which I will tell you in the course of time as context arises.